time we could do this, so let's go for it. So last class, Farley was talking about, excuse me, could you, one of those, please sign this and back to the class. So last class, Farley started talking about hip-hop, rap hip-hop. And so we're going to continue on today and follow this up through the 80s, 90s, and see how far we get. So just to kind of give some context to what was going on in the 1980s and sort of what sort of defines the popular music industry through the 1980s. Some really important, I think, contextual factors. And stop me if this is, again, I don't know exactly what Farley has, maybe he's talked about some of this. If he has, then please put up your hand and tell me. But really one of the most important factors that really changes radically and defines the popular music industry through the 1980s is that in 1979, the North American record industry goes through a recession. The first one that's happened in decades. For decades, the record industry has just been expanding constantly, this ever-expanding industry, huge sales, ever more. But for the first time, this drops in 1979. And it really is a radical effect. Here we have some numbers. Hit bottom in 1982, 4.6 billion, down 500 million from the peak in 1978. So it's a huge decline in profits. And this, of course, coincides with a wider economic recession starting around 1979 as well, due to the energy crisis, due to the Iranian Revolution, the outbreak of the Iran-Iraq War. All these things start to, and of course, an attempt to curb the inflation through very high interest rates. Very, very high inflation, and to keep and to sort of check this, to stop this, to bring these down, the central banks had very high interest rates. To compare, and all of us sort of kind of live in a very different world, but to compare, presently the U.S. has a prime interest rate of around 3.25%. In 1982, this hit 21%. Imagine paying your credit cards or a mortgage when that was the prime rate. Crazy. And Canada, again, has around 3%. In 1981, this hit 22.75%. Increasing influence of digital music and digital technologies as opposed to analog. So this is when CDs started to be introduced in the early 80s, which was seen as a great savior for the recording industry. That people would be buying all these old records, but now we're having them on CD. This brand new technology, which could play forever because wasn't damaged in like records or analog technologies. So the compact disc, other technologies, sampling, other things we're going to be talking about a bit later. First album that released on CD, Billy Joel's Second Streets, and finally there was a million selling CD with Brothers in Arms, Dire Straits Brothers in Arms in 1985. And this was seen as sort of the savior of this depressed industry, which is ironic in retrospect given what we know now about what's happened with the music digitization, which has actually been kind of the downfall of the record industry, in fact. But I'm sure Farley will get into that later. But of course, 1979 was also the year of what in terms of hip-hop? What happened in 1979?
Rapper's Delight.
Rapper's Delight, indeed, the very first hip-hop rap single to be released, really started to break things open. So just to kind of review some of the musical aesthetics of hip-hop, what is different about it? To review, so what is the musical aesthetic of hip-hop? Behind these practices of DJ and MC. So what is the difference, just again to remind us, what is the difference between a DJ and an MC? What are their different roles? And this is somewhat included now, but certainly in the early years, this was a very important distinction. What's the difference between an MC and a DJ? Anybody else? Yeah, okay.
The DJ takes care of like the background music and like mixes the tracks over, or like the MC is the one actually finding the lyrics and was kind of like making.
Right. Yeah. So DJ, disc jockey, the one who's creating the tracks at first, by playing these breaks over and over again, switching between records. Whereas the MC is the one who's the rapper, the one who's doing the toasting, doing the exhortation to get the crowd pumped up and such things. And in terms of just sort of comparing this to the broader pop music industry, this really does challenge the dominance of the guitar within popular music. Ever since the birth of rock and roll, the guitar has been the popular music instrument. And here we have a sort of a challenge to that, and you know, with turntables of all things, turntables as an instrument, which is a very interesting kind of reversal of its use as a musical reproduction into a musical production tool, sort of inverse relation. But it certainly continues a long African American musical tradition of subordinating melody and harmony to rhythm. And just to again remind ourselves, you know, a great example going back a few decades is Bo Diddley. So. Right. It's just a live recording of the song, right? It's just that one chord. It never changes. It's not the melody, it's not the harmony, it's the rhythm that really drives this song. So this change really goes back a long way, but hip hop just kind of takes this and kind of takes it to its, in a sense, its logical conclusion. So the economic condition that this comes out of is a very, very strong importance, and does come out of the South Bronx, New York City in general, and it's really important. Like, how many of you have been to New York before? Probably a lot of you, most of you. You know, New York now is a very safe city. Very, you go to Times Square. It's this kind of Disneyland. You know, there's everything. Very, very nice. Very, very touristy. At this point, this was not the case. New York City was a very, very dangerous place. Even when I was fairly young in the early 90s, it was still an enormous murder rate. In the 1970s, this is kind of when this began, the white flight from the late 60s, a lot of the urban riots that were going on, and just sort of a flight to the suburbs, hollowed out the tax base of a lot of these large cities, leading, by the mid-1970s, New York City almost went bankrupt, and would have gone bankrupt if not for a loan from the federal government. South Bronx is one of the worst affected of these areas. The blackout of 1977 leads to a huge, a lot of looting, and some scholars have speculated, and hip-hop historians have speculated that it was actually, in fact, precisely that a lot of the people in the South Bronx looted a lot of turntables and stereo equipment, which they then used to actually create hip-hop, which is an interesting kind of historical, yes, so they didn't have the resources to buy traditional instruments, but they improvised ones into turntables. And if any of you are interested in this time period, there's a really interesting period piece by Spike Lee, a film from 1999 called Summer of Sam, which is set during the New York City blackout of 1977. It's a very, very interesting film. So so as kind of that's our kind of review. So what's going on in the mid-'80s and onward, which is kind of our focus for today. Women start to play a greater role in hip-hop and rap. Greater political commentary becomes, certainly you saw that with Grandmaster Flash, The Message, very different than Rapper's Delight. Rapper's Delight, there's nothing political about it. It's about like, yeah, let's have fun, let's party. Here's my gang kind of thing. But certainly Grandmaster Flash and The Message becomes very influential, and there's certainly a great move towards greater explicit commentary in a lot of hip-hop music. Begins to appear on MTV. So I think you've probably heard about how when MTV started, it was very, very white, very white. And mostly played a lot of new wave bands. That was sort of what dominated the airwaves on MTV. But really starts to come in the mid-'80s after the success of people like Michael Jackson and Prince, and certainly as hip-hop becomes an increasingly bigger part of the recording music industry. Excuse me, please grab one of those. And an increasing, and crossover with other genres. I think Farley played you the Walk This Way crossover between Run DMC and Aerosmith. So there's an increasing crossover with other genres, an increasing differentiation between different sort of subgenres of hip hop. So hardcore, Two Live Crew, progressives, alternative, Tribe Called Quest, and gangster, such as NWA and Ice-T. And also white rappers. So Farley also talked a bit about the Beastie Boys. So their 1986 album, License to Ill, was a huge hit. First hip-hop album to hit #1, hugely influential. And just to play this, because this is the first track off that album, why was this so influential? Why was it so popular?
Digitized drums.
Well, digitized, but what are they samples of? Okay, well there's Led Zeppelin and somebody else. Anybody know the other one? Alright. I can't really hear the guitar very well. Anyone know that guitar riff? So it's the drum part from When the Levee Breaks Led Zeppelin and the guitar riff from Sweet Leaf by Black Sabbath. So so this is part of this sort of broader crossover. They're white, they're three Jewish kids from Brooklyn, and they're taking, two kind of emblematic representatives of white heavy metal music. Led Zeppelin and Black Sabbath doesn't get more kind of white and heavy metal than that, and they're using that as the basis for the opening of their song, which they tongue-in-cheek called Rhymin' and Stealin'. Very, very, very conscious about that. So it's a very interesting in that sense. And how can we relate these changes? Okay, so these various changes that have happened, how can we think about these in relation to earlier events in the history of popular music? Because this is always very important because a lot of these things kind of come in cycles and sort of repeat themselves in various forms. And so, so the influence of black R&B on white musicians and audiences, questions of appropriation. Certainly one can think about that in terms of the Beastie Boys. It's not Run DMC that has the first #1 hip hop album. It's, again, three white Jewish kids from Brooklyn. Could we think of this in terms of questions of appropriation? Is there something problematic here? Then this, the question of development of rock versus pop versus earlier rock and roll. So the assertion in the mid-'60s, people like Bob Dylan and the Beatles who said, okay, we're creating popular music, but we're different than the earlier rock and roll. We're different than pop. We're serious artists. So this is also happening at this time in the mid-'80s. So that you have a similar kind of process of differentiation as at least certain hip-hop musicians and artists start to assert their artistic bona fides. We're not just, about partying and whatever. We're about serious artists and dealing with serious issues. Political involvement. So we saw that certainly with, in terms of, you saw that. I wasn't actually teaching at that point. But the political involvement of folk rock, which again was part of this broader assertion of the relevance, the importance of rock music and of folk rock. So again, this is sort of recapitulated in the 80s with hip hop. Certainly people like Public Enemy, which is kind of the emblematic example of sort of politically relevant hip hop. And again, so this assertion of rock status as art. So now there's an assertion of rap and hip hop status as art, as something to be taken seriously, not simply just, it's not just something to be, for the kids, it's something to be taken seriously as art. And increasing crossover. So again, we saw it was this in the 1960s, these crossovers, folk rock, psychedelic rock, Latin rock, hard rock. Again, this sort of repeats itself in the 80s with various forms of hip hop. In terms of the influence of women, again, we saw that there was this in the 1960s, the early 1960s with girl groups, people like the Shirelles, and then later in the 1970s, the early 1970s, the importance, the very, very strong importance of women singer-songwriters. in the late 60s and early 70s, especially. Oh yeah, we already did this, didn't we? So don't do that. So, question of sampling. So, when we just heard that Ryman and Steele and Beastie Boys, is there the question kind of poses itself? Is there a difference between theft and creative recontextualization? This becomes a huge issue with people like the Beastie Boys as sampling becomes increasingly obvious. Certainly with Rapper's Delight, it's pretty clear it's Chic's Good Times, but it's not. But it's simply the baseline. So it's kind of, you know, they're borrowing, but it's not too obvious. But certainly with something like Ryman and Steelin', it's right in your face. No one who knows when the levee breaks and Sweetly could possibly not know that that's the basis of the song. But is there a difference here? And if so, what is the difference between theft and creative recontextualization? In 1991, this gets a lot of publicity when two hit rap songs quite, again, obviously borrow key elements. MC Hammer's You Can't Touch This, which samples Rick James' Super Freak, and Vanilla Ice's Ice Ice Baby, which samples Queen David Bowie's Under Pressure. And is this, or are these rather instances of the old quote that has been attributed to all sorts of people, Stravinsky, Picasso, T.S. Eliot, that good artists borrow, great artists steal? Or is this somehow illicit? Is this problematic? Is this different than what other older musicians do when they say are influenced? When the British blues musicians or the Beatles were influenced very strongly by older musicians. They certainly borrowed, but here it's not just borrowing musical ideas. It's actually borrowing the literal texture of the music, the literal recorded sound. What's the difference? Is it a difference? Is it a difference that matters? Is it something that one can say that there's something illicit about the latter, but okay about the former? But the result is that record labels become highly protective of their own material and resistant to their musicians sampling from others. And arguably, many hip-hop albums from this time period, from the sort of the 80s, many people think of this today as sort of a golden time period, a golden period when you could do so many things with samples. Whereas in the 90s, things got there were a number of major lawsuits, and record companies got very strict about what you could use. And there's a great article there on Slate.com, and they talked about how, in terms of the Beastie Boys' second album, Paul's Boutique, which is again a really epic album using just hundreds of different samples in all these different instances, but how you just could not even make this album today. Just there's no way a record company would possibly allow that album to be released because of just the rampant sample usage. So it's something that's had a lot of impact on how people make music, because where something was you could do something like that in the 1980s, you simply can't do that anymore. Certainly by the mid-90s, it was not possible. All right, and so here we have Rick James' Super Freak. And then compared to, he actually hasn't even changed the key. Or Queen David Bowie. So what do you guys think about this? Just to open it up to the floor, what do you guys think about this, this debate about creative recontextualization versus theft, and how this relates to the sort of the longer history of borrowing and quote-unquote stealing in popular music, or not just in popular music, because of course classical music as well, not just popular musicians that are influenced by other musicians. Yeah?
It was, I can't remember when it was, I think 2006, 2007, but there was this artist who you might remember, he came out with a song called Man's Gotta Be a Stone, and they're playing on the radio a lot. And there was a really interesting thing on a radio show where they talked about how it was complete and like shameless rip-off of ZZ Top's The Range.
Oh, I think I remember this, yes.
And the argument that one of the guys made was, if you look, and he actually used Ice Baby as sort of his reference to the 90s. So in general, I see the argument he added sort of a new dimension to it as an interpretation, and it's a song sort of telling how it's perceived by the listeners completely different, where it's just shameless and just a replication. So his argument is that sampling is sort of an important part of musical influence being passed down through decades through genres, especially for looking at crossovers and things like that. But there has to be an element of an added layer of intricacy of musical interpretation, whereas just sort of straight ripping something off is pointless and should not be made. So it's kind of a subjective line to be true, but that was a really interesting perspective.
Yeah, absolutely, and that would be, you know, you could think of that in terms of a longer history of questions of parody or you know, fair use in terms of that's a long-standing legal standard that if you're writing a parody of something, well, the whole point of it is that you have to be able to recognize the original for the parody to work. So so if that's going to be allowed, you obviously have to be able to use it. And so in the same sense, yes, if you're taking something, a sample, and you're doing something creative with it, then that should be allowed. But then, of course, the question is, as you say, how do you then determine what's creative, and when you're adding that extra layer is, you know, in the case of Ice Ice Baby and MC Hammer, are there additions? Is that creative? Is that a meaningful extra layer, or are they simply taking these very iconic musical elements, stealing them, and just sort of, you know, adding their rap over top of it and claiming it as their own? And, you know, both of those songs, I'm pretty sure, went to #1. They were huge hits on #1. Huge hits. So it does get dicey. It does get very dicey. But, you know, and of course, even going back to the 1970s, there was a very famous case against George Harrison, My Sweet Lord, on his album, his 1970 album, All Things Must Pass, which he ended up being sued by somebody who, by the songwriter for a song from the early 60s, which does bear a resemblance to, but in the end, the court decided that in fact he had ripped them off, although unconsciously, and he had to give the other guy partial writing credit. So there's many issues. Yep.
Just a counter argument. If you were to copy it and sort of make all occasions, then that's copying more so than maybe in this way where it's clearly direct, you know, copy. So that's sort of more paying homage, and it's sort of saying, yes, I'm taking it from them, but you know, because I appreciate that music. Whereas if you take it and then change it, that's more copyright.
So you would actually prefer where it's the explicitness of, say, MC Hammer or Ice Ice Baby, where it's obvious that there's no doubt where they're getting the basis of these songs. There's nothing hidden there, and you actually think that that's sort of that should be that's actually better than in the case of something where you're using it in a more sort of subterfuge fashion.
I'm not saying I believe that.
Or,
I'm just saying
okay, counter. Okay, yeah, that's interesting. Because certainly, I think you probably talked about Public Enemy, and they became very famous. The Bomb Squad, which was their sort of production team, which would create sort of the basic tracks for their albums, they would just use, you know, they were using, you know, really high-tech computers and samplers at the time, and creating this incredibly dense, you know, layers of samples on layers of samples, to the point where you can't even tell where, you know, to actually track down each sample. Same thing with Paul Boutique. Some of them, you know, sometimes you do get really obvious ones like Rhyming and Stealing, where it's just really in your face. But sometimes it's just so woven into this dense, you know, morass of samples that you can't even tell. So in that case, you know, if you can't tell, then do you need permission? Or it doesn't matter at that point? Or precisely following that counter argument, is actually even worse because you're using it and there's no real way, even though there is a sort of aesthetic impact, there is some sort of meaningful impact in the music, you can't actually tell where it's coming from. Anybody else? Maybe before anybody else who wants to jump in? Or you want to respond? Or?
And that's like a really important study as well. There was, I don't know where it came up, but it was a compilation on Very Young Body Policy, and it was a compilation of contemporary artists doing interpretations of popular Body Policy songs. So it was Modest Mouse and Tim Adams, a bunch of people, but Isaac Rock had an interview with David Butler. He said the thing was really difficult because when he was going to see a lot of Body Policy, it was a big influence for him to take it and try and recreate it in a way that wasn't sort of as, I guess, respectful to the original as possible. So it's sort of seemed difficult for him because, people was what Body Policy wrote, they wrote it a certain way, it sounded a certain way for a reason. But for it to be a sort of artistic there had to be some element of reinterpretation.
Right.
So although the song sort of wasn't changed in terms of how it was written, the way it was performed and recorded was completely different. And it's very much a Modest Mouse song. And it was kind of like maybe it was very difficult to decide which one is more, I guess, acceptable. Because that was, it was distributed as a cover song, so
Right.
or if it's even still went that way.
Right, and that's, that there's a long history. You've certainly talked about cover songs and how the value of cover songs has usually been precisely because of some sort of reinterpretation, often because of some desire to cross over. So, I think something like the Tennessee Waltz, which is originally this country song, or country waltz, and then gets adopted by Patti Page as this very poppy, schmaltzy interpretation. This is a kind of constant thing of taking a song and reinterpreting it in various ways. So just like that, taking a Buddy Holly songs from the 50s, sort of reinterpreting them in sort of the musical language of the 2000s, it makes it interesting. But in terms of, is that different than, say, samples? Like, what is the difference, and why? And I guess the most important question really is, why is this such an issue? Because certainly, just to kind of compare to what kind of happens and how this sort of impacts sort of broader social feelings and beliefs about hip hop, is how this ties into sort of questions of the very legitimacy of hip hop in terms of its associations with gang life, ghetto life, and in terms of, in fact, it's very question of its legitimacy as music. So just before we get to that though, just this question of moral panic. So certainly in the readings for today, chapter 73, you get the sense of moral panic. Hip hop represents this sort of intolerable assault on the values of society. It condones violence and all sorts of sexualization of women, et cetera, et cetera. And many responses and many rebuttals are offered. One being, a group like Run DMC from the earlier years, certainly more progressive or so-called alternative hip hop later on in the 90s. Certainly some hip hop has very positive messages and positive meanings. So certainly not all hip hop you can just sort of ignore and treat as somehow morally degenerate. Chuck D of Public Enemy famously retorts, well, you think hip hop's offensive? Well, the black viewpoint is always considered offensive. That's just, because you're in a racist society in which blacks are second-class citizens, they're always going, any time that the second-class citizens assert their authority and their power, that's always going to be considered offensive, no matter what. On one hand, you have, they're not advocating at sort of the top of the popular music industry. And, it makes sense. One can't, one can obviously not excuse that, but one can understand where they're coming from, their perspective, in feeling somewhat fearful. And it's a fact. Guitar-based music is far less popular than it used to be. That's just a fact. But then things change, and guitars weren't always the most popular instrument. There's no reason why they should always remain the most popular instrument. Yep.
I I just find it interesting because if you look at like the modern era music from like the early 1900s, there's a lot of music that's like water dripping voices and train tracks, and that doesn't have melody and it didn't have instruments, and yet it was considered very acclaimed, and classical musicians really appreciated it. And I think that this is something that has to keep coming up in this class. Like you kind of said it, it stems from this year and this social context that where this music was coming from was from what was considered like lower class and lower status members of society. And I think that's sort of why it wasn't part of why it wasn't accepted as music, because other music doesn't have those intentions left.
Right, and I'm not sure if Farley's talked to you about there's a very famous social theorist named Pierre Bourdieu, where he talks about how these sort of artistic cycles all depend on these constant battles between generations. And so how one generation, so for example, the early rock and rollers, were coming up. They were the young generation, and they were fighting against the older sort of Frank Sinatra generation. And so then they have to define themselves and say, no, we're different, we're better. And of course Frank Sinatra was saying, no, you horrible rock and rollers, how dare you? This is horrible, crappy music. And then by the 1960s, it's sort of you get these sort of the rock musicians of the Beatles, Bob Dylan, people like that, asserting themselves as artists in reaction to what's come before. And again, it's sort of each generation has to define itself against the preceding generation in some ways. So in a sense, this is these very repeated processes of here in the 1980s, you have hip hop. Well, you not only have the issue of these sort of musical changes, but you also have the whole racial aspect of a very strongly identified African American art form, in a way that while rock and roll and rock certainly came out of R&B and music very much associated with the African American diaspora, hip hop was far stronger associated with African American culture, and so it didn't. And even though you did have crossovers like Beastie Boys and Ice and Vanilla Ice and all that, it was a far more challenging sense of music and of sort of the relationship between whites and blacks certainly in North America and certainly in the United States. Anyone else want to throw out any thoughts on this question of the aesthetic arguments against or for rap? Okay, well let's move on then. Chapter 74, nothing but a G thing, and this is broadly about the popularity of gangster rap, which becomes very, very influential and very controversial in the late 80s, early 90s. Groups like NWA, Ice-T, Ice Cube, all of these gain a lot of attention, a lot of debate, especially in the wake, sort of leading up to, and certainly in the wake of the Rodney King beating and the LA riots that break out after the acquittal of the police officers in '92, which was a big, big deal at the time. But Snoop Doggy Dogg in particular, how is he portrayed, and why focus on him? What's sort of special about him? Well, he's featured previously on Dr. Dre's very popular album, The Chronic, hugely popular. It was highly anticipated debut album of a hip-hop artist. And again, this sort of sense of distinctiveness, distinctive, fresh, laid-back vocal approach. As he says, I put it down with a twist. And again, this assertion of reality, of keeping it real, which we're going to get into a bit more later. I can't rap about something I don't know, he says on page 450. Well, why not? And why is it's all everyday life reality? So again, how does this connect to earlier themes that you've studied in the history of popular music? This assertion of a connection between art and reality. Yep.
It's the same thing with singing. There's like this inherent connection. Like in singing, it was a performing rap. It's a form of like social, like connected social experience and like a form of like personal.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. the blues is absolutely a very strong assertion that there's this very strong relation between the life and what they're singing about. So that, and you know, hence the constant, you know, the continuing mythologization of people like Robert Johnson, and the very fact that he's so mythologized is precisely because, you know, he died in these mysterious circumstances, and you know, he sort of fits that sort of starving artist, you know, kind of tortured artist, even though, and I'm not sure if Farley talked about this, but there's plenty of evidence that Robert Johnson, in his actual performances, performed a very wide range of music, not just sort of what we would think of as sort of Delta blues, pop songs you hear on the radio. But when he went to record, and of course all we have of his music are these recordings, these not even that many recordings. The people who recorded him, they didn't want those pop recordings. They wanted a certain kind of music because they had a certain image of him. So for him to just record, you know, your standard pop drill, which he would do when he was playing at the juke joints where he was making his money, they didn't want those songs. They wanted a certain kind. So that's because that was all that was recorded. That's what we think of as Robert Johnson, sort of defining Robert Johnson. When in fact it's a very selective view of that. But again, yes, there's, you know, in the British blues boom and in the 1960s, and how that carried back over into the United States, North America, the blues did represent this sort of strong, you know, that there was something real here. This music was an expression of something, you know, that you know was a real part of these people's lives. Anyone else? Any other connections to earlier histories, popular music histories? Yeah.
Probably what we've seen with authenticity and the fact that
With
authenticity.
Okay, authenticity in what sense, and with anyone in particular?
Well, we've like basically based every like analysis of genres with like how empathetic the artists were, like starting with older music and that they're like true to themselves and true to like what they're talking about, and that they singing about what they've experienced and like not faking any sort of reality or something like that, and remaining like true to the music.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'll just point back to page 73 of the reader, actually, Hank Williams. You asked what makes our kind of music successful. Williams was saying, I'll tell you, it can be explained in just one word: sincerity. When a hillbilly sings a crazy song, he feels crazy. When he sings, I laid my mother away, he sees her laying right there in the coffin. So even in, you know, country music, going back to the 40s, the same idea of authenticity, of sincerity, keeping it real, the same kind of trope that just sort of repeats itself in these various different genres of music. Really the same issue at play. And what is the issue at play? Why is reality, authenticity, sincerity so important? Why do these musicians and their audiences constantly assert these values repeatedly through the decades in popular music? What's at stake? Yeah.
This isn't a popular view, but nothing's at stake. It's just it sells. So they, like, you know, say it's authentic. Especially like the hillbillies. That's like, you didn't see your mother lying in the coffin there when you sang that. Like, you know what I mean? Like, that's definitely not true. And like even in rap, it's, yeah, they're keeping it real, but hyperbolizing to like the umpteenth degree. You know what I mean? So it really doesn't matter, and nothing's really at stake. It's just it sells. So you have to say that it's real.
Okay, well that's certainly a perspective, and that's certainly a perspective that I'm somewhat sympathetic to. I can certainly see that. You know, I think that's the sort of most cynical, and I totally respect that. Absolutely valid. But can we think? Can we? And anyone else want to sort of take a different take on that? Or yeah.
Perhaps in terms of rap and hip hop, like we just talked about sampling and how it wasn't perceived as kind of real music. So to layer the kind of authenticity argument on top of that could be working to kind of contrast with people who are saying, oh, it's not real music, and then to have something that says, no, it's actually really real, like it's coming from my experience.
Okay, so it's kind of a mechanism, a sort of a defensive mechanism, saying, okay, you say our music isn't real because we're not using real instruments. but it is real because it's coming from our own experience. It's authentic to our lives. It's authentic to our realities. So therefore, regardless of the musical qualities or the origins of the music itself, it is real because it's real to us. Or, yes, absolutely. I think that's absolutely the case. Although I think that's an interesting way of thinking about hip hop, but that wouldn't really so much apply to, say, country music or blues, or even rock music, right? In the 1960s, when rock music, as opposed to rock and roll, when people like Dylan and the Beatles and the whole sort of San Francisco rock scene, when they very much thought of themselves in the same way, that they were serious artists, they were authentic, they were expressing something authentic. Anyone else have any thoughts about that? So while there's the totally, this is just purely cynical commercialism trying to sell an idea. But then actually to kind of respond to that, yes, I think you're right. There is absolutely, one can never divorce commercial imperatives and commercial demands within popular music. Popular music is a commercial, the commercial demand is always there. Always. I think that's just, one has to constantly acknowledge that as a given. But then I think you can push further back. Then why is it still important? Why is it that it's continuing, that authenticity sells? That there is this desire to somehow connect this music, which is so commercially mediated, which is so defined by its commercial status and its commercial quality. Why is it so still important, decade after decade, to assert its reality, its authenticity, because yes, one can think of it purely cynically, but yet it has a continuing value. It has a continuing productive quality to it, decade after decade. So there's something to me that what that points to is that there's something there that people want. That people want to have they want to hear music. When they hear music, they want to at least believe that there's something real there. And so then it's like, why is that? Why is it this? That to me is the more interesting question. Is why is it decade after decade continually this same trope, which is recycled and revamped in various musical forms and various, in all sorts of ways. You wanted to jump in there?
To me, if it's not authentic, it's not a genuine artistic expression. So that has a negative impact on our relationship with music.
And could I then ask you, what do you mean by authentic? How do you define authenticity? For like or perhaps what doesn't qualify perhaps negatively? What rules out something as being authentic?
Well, personal experience. If you're just making something up, then you're clearly doing it for commercial purposes. And there's different types of authenticity in different types of music. Like when you think of rap music, and then you think of post-punk artists like George with Dean Curtis and Suicide. That kind of lends to a certain degree of authenticity in his music. When rap music, if you were shot, a gang shooting.
We're kind of going to get into that in a little bit, but yes, there is. But then in the case of Dean Curtis, yes, retrospectively after he died, that gave his music a great deal of authenticity, precisely because of what happened to him, or the fact that Jimi Hendrix and Janis Joplin and Jim Morrison, they all died at 27. They all died. Kurt Cobain, they all died at 27. So it's very easy to sort of have this sense of authenticity when you die at 27. What if Jimi Hendrix was still alive and still playing music? We'd probably think he was a sellout and just maybe back in the 60s he was good, but now he's just such a sellout. It's so how does this notion of authenticity, and as you say, authenticity has very different articulations. So on one hand, there's the authenticity of certainly classical music, the authenticity to the score. Then there's the authenticity to personal experience. So how, authenticity to the music? In the case of someone like Bob Dylan, who famously, invented his name. His name is not Bob Dylan. His name's Robert Zimmerman. That was his original name. Or Elton John, Reginald Dwight. These people. Popular music is filled with fakes, in a sense. Like it's all about fakery and creation of these personas. But is that a bad thing? In the case of David Bowie, right? David Bowie, you've talked about the most famous sort of chameleon of popular music, who's constantly reinvented himself. And the question of authenticity, that there's something real, like who's the real David Bowie, almost is kind of an absurd question. There is no real David Bowie. David Bowie is simply this character that this person keeps on, changing constantly in all sorts of different musical forms and styles. The question of authenticity is seemingly completely irrelevant. Or is it precisely the fact that he's so open with his inauthenticity that there's a sense of authenticity in his inauthenticity? Kind of starts to make your head explode. Anyone else want to say anything here? Yeah?
For me, the idea is a musician makes music for an intended person, and so that a rapper will make music for somebody specific in mind, and the closer that they can relate to their life, and the more believable they are in their, how their life is, the easier it will be for them to be understood, kind of. Like, Eminem has rapped to people directly, has, tried to, invigorate people and, say that my life was shit, but I've managed to build myself up and get myself out of there. Just follow me. It's possible for you to, a rapper like Logic, who's had a really, truly terrible life, had so many bad things happen to him, has been able to, use his bad experiences to tell people that, good things happen if you work at it. So kind of the idea that the more things have happened to you, the more authentic you can be and the more emotion you can portray in your music, because you've experienced things that other people may have to a lesser degree or to any degree at all,
Yeah, I think that's very interesting. Although I think again it really is very genre specific. And I think it's certainly and at least and a great deal of hip hop that's very important. Although we're going to talk about sort of party rap where where the sort of the blatant materialism of it almost seems to be where the value in the fact that they sort of revel in this sort of unbridled materialism, in this sort of the success that they are just millionaires and have endless girls and cars and all these things, and
that's not necessarily respected. As somebody who appreciates rap, you might not necessarily respect that as much as you do somebody who is being more true about themselves.
Quite possibly, yes. But then at the same time that has become very popular, at least in some genres. So I think it depends on the kind of music. Again, certain kinds of country music, and this is often divides different rock versus pop. Real country, traditional country versus pop country. Maybe party rap versus hardcore or gangster rap. Right? Often these distinctions often play on this question of authenticity, how important this question of authenticity is. Maybe you want to say one last thing, or?
Well, I just want to say that it all has value in the end, because you can talk about, with Logic, even though he's being real, you know what I mean? That has value, but then when we hear even Snoop rapping gin and juice, there's still there's still value to that. Mostly because Snoop's an incredible rapper and the beat's really good. But still, you know what I mean? And it's just that, and with the authenticity thing, I wanted to point out that when we listen to bands like Joy Division, authenticity is the last thing that makes it so awesome. You know what I mean? No, I'm just saying. You know what I mean?
Well, and the question, one can just say, if you like the music, if you like the beat, who cares if it's authentic, or just constantly authentic Indian restaurant, authentic Japanese restaurant. Why does that matter? If the food is good, what does it matter if it's authentic or not? What does it mean even to be authentic anything? Everything is a hybrid, everything was a product of history. Nothing is really purely authentic anyways, because that doesn't actually exist. And yet we constantly desire this. It's such an interesting thing, even though And even though I study this, this is what I do for a living, I still have notions of why I like music. And when I analyze myself, it still comes down to some degree on some idea of what is authentic. So it's kind of this inescapable thing. It's endlessly fascinating. So just to continue on and how this relates to gangster rap, what is gangsta rap? Well, a few sort of general descriptions. It is about the description of the violence and danger and problems of urban ghetto life, African Americans living in the ghetto, whether that's in Baltimore or New York or Compton or wherever. Definitely more confrontational, anti-authoritarian, explicitly anti-authoritarian. So someone like Ice Cube in the early 90s, his song Cop Killer, enormously controversial, that was just huge. Generally in terms of the musical sound, very driving, hearted grooves, certainly compared to earlier forms, certainly compared to contemporary forms like MC Hammer. You compare Ice-T to MC Hammer, it's a very different sound world. Some key albums that are talked about in the reader, obviously Dr. Dre's The Chronic and Snoop Doggy Dogg's Snoop Doggy Style. And so let's just talk about some of this music. So, Who Am I? Based on Atomic Dog by P-Funk. Snoop Doggy Dogg has actually pretty much made a career out of sampling P-Funk. It's all over his music. He clearly loves that music and that comes out a lot in his music. But what are some of the differences, and how does Snoop borrow from P-Funk? So let's just listen to some of this. Here's Snoop Dogg. Why is it so quiet? What is that? Anyone recognize that? It's actually from another. So it's from another P-Funk song. I think the Mothership Connection or something. So he's actually using a melodic line from a previous. So he's basing the whole song on this, which is Atomic Dog, P-Funk 1982. All right, so what are some of the differences? So yeah, so he's primarily basing Who Am I on Atomic Dog, but he's also including elements of other P-Funk songs, including this vocal line that the backup singers use from another P-Funk tune. Very interesting. So what are some of the differences? How can we think about this tune? So you have a song analysis due, I believe, next week from today. So, given that, how can we think about this tune? What are some of the things we could say about it? if we were, say, writing a song analysis, imagine you're trying to write a song analysis on Who Am I? How can we think about it? What are some of its elements that are significant? Other than the fact that it's obviously based on P-Funk, but what about, what did we hear that is significant in any ways? Well, what about the tempo between them? Is there some sort of difference there? What's the tempo in relation to P-Funk? This is faster than the other one? No, it's slower. It's slowed down. Really bit more of a groove to it, not quite as up-tempo dancey. What can we say about his vocal style? Yeah, it's definitely laid back. Here you have this immediate sort of this immediate into the groove, right? Whereas in the Who Am I, you have this sort of weird little sample at the beginning that kind of sets this kind of strain, kind of destabilizing. You're not quite sure where you are before the groove starts. Whereas this one, you go right into it. You know, very much more of a dance floor number, right? You want that groove right from the start. Very different from the other one. Yep. Well, yeah, it's like the beat's much more. It's much more on top of the beat. There's much more of a groove, kind of
There's more like emphasis on separate sounds.
It does seem a bit kind of cleaner, just in terms of the note attacks. Yeah, I'd agree with you there. Whereas the other one is a bit more. It's a bit messier, a bit more. All over. Yep.
Also in Who Am I, there's this like heavier, like drippier, like synth bass line, and I don't know if there's one, like if there's a faster one in Atomic Dog, but like I can't really hear it through the speakers. But yeah, and Who Am I has this like drawn out, like just heavy, like a bit delayed bass line, and that's one of my favorite parts of that song.
Yeah, yeah, and well, you do. There is a little synth line in Atomic Dog, like just sort of playing the rhythm sort of before the main melody comes in. So I think that's probably where Snoop kind of got the idea. But yeah, he's lowered it. It's a lot heavier. It's a lot dirtier sound. More in the bass.
Yeah.
The one in Atomic Dog is far more up in the far higher range, tessitura range. So yeah, so it's interesting how he's, so it's really an amazing example of how he's taken this song, he's playing with it and sort of developing certain elements of it, also connecting it to its own some of its own pre-existing music of P-Funk, and he sort of incorporates